So today we're going to talk about noise gates. What they are, but more importantly, how we can use them to make our music better.
Let's go.
So what is a noise gate?
And why do I keep making videos about them?
I think I'm obsessed.
I mean, don't they just cut the volume and then switch it back on again?
Well, yes. But is that all they do? Yes.
I still love them though.
And here's why.
So, very quickly, for those that aren't aware, let's look at what a noise gate does, as well as the main controls that are available to us and what they do. So a noise gate is essentially just an on-off volume control that we can apply to an audio signal. Similar to a compressor, we use a threshold level to determine when the noise gate becomes active. Unlike a compressor, however, which becomes active when the source signal exceeds the threshold, a noise gate will activate when the sound level from our source drops below the threshold, and the noise gate will then react according to the settings that we give it to attenuate the volume of that audio signal. The main controls that we have are this threshold amount, which will determine at what point the noise gate becomes active. We have this reduction dial, which at -100 decibels will essentially completely cut the signal when it becomes active. If we set it all the way at 0 dB, this will essentially mean that the noise gate has no effect whatsoever. Or we can choose to set it anywhere in between, which will then attenuate the sound by the amount that we set this reduction. In most cases, we'll probably leave this at 100 decibels to completely cut any unwanted sound. We also have the attack, hold and release settings, but before I get to that, let's have a look at this diagram. So let's imagine that this is our waveform, and these peaks, let's just imagine they're peaking at 0 decibels. This red line now represents our threshold, and we can set this wherever we choose. So for example, let's say we set this at -20 decibels. So this red line is now set to -20 decibels. As soon as our audio signal reaches this threshold, our noise gate will react according to the attack time that we set. A longer attack time will make for a smoother transition. A shorter attack time will mean that it reacts very quickly. If we have it on 0 milliseconds, this will react immediately, and it may cause some pops or clicks, which may be unwanted. They may also be desirable. The hold and release then determine how long after the attack phase that the noise gate takes to fully engage. If we push the release up, this will create for a much smoother transition between the full signal and the attenuated signal. Other than that, we have a few other controls which I won't go into here. One thing I will point out very quickly, because I do talk about it in the following videos, is the sidechain. So in order to set a sidechain, we would come to this drop down menu up here, and we have various options of things that we can set as an input for our sidechain. That's a very quick explanation of what a noise gate does and some of the controls that we have. So now let's get into the video. Hi guys, Unknown Audio back with you again after a very long absence. I apologise for that. But let's just get stuck into this. I'll look at this project and talk you through how I've used a noise gate in a creative way to help inspire the track. I know I'm talking about noise gates again. I know looking back through some of my previous videos, I kind of talk about these quite a lot, but I do tend to use them quite a lot in sound design in the creative process, and I think they're really useful in lots of different ways. So I'm just going to talk about that today and show you some of the sound design and ideas they spark along the way. So the track at the start of this video, we're going to be delving into this a little bit. It's a fairly straightforward project, but well, I'll give you a little, you've obviously heard it in the intro, but let's have a little listen. I'll drop you in about here. Okay, so I think you get the idea. It's quite a funky little number, and you'll have to excuse the garish colouring that I've used for these regions. I've done that in order to hopefully try and make it a little bit more visually easy for you to understand which regions are kind of related, even though they might be completely different instruments, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So essentially, if I start with this sound here, this is what I started with. And apart from the reverb that I've got on this bus 2 send, that is as the sample was. This is just from the Apple loops. So that's what I started with, quite nice sort of chords there. And there's already a nice pulsing rhythm in that sample. But I wanted to use that and use a noise gate being triggered by some kind of rhythmical percussive element to generate a more interesting rhythm for it. So if we come to this one, and if I solo this world drums as well, this is what's generating the rhythm. And then we also have up here, I have the high chords, as I've called them, which has been triggered by this blip groove. And that sounds like this. So that's exactly the same sample. What I've done is I've pitched that up 12 semitones, and what's generating the rhythm on this pitched up sort of chord pattern is, it's a software instrument. It's the Klopfgeist. I find this is quite good for these sort of things. I believe it's what they use for the metronome. It gives a very clean, clear kind of blip. It's quite a quick, clear sort of sound, and I find that's quite a good thing to use as a trigger for a sidechain. So if I just put the output back on, so that's the rhythm. I've just drawn it in with MIDI notes. It's all bang on the grid, which is a little bit robotic. So you could, if you wanted to, spend a bit of time maybe moving these MIDI notes sort of individually and giving it a bit more of a feel. You could apply a swing to it. I've just kind of left it. I'm not too worried, because what I'm mainly doing is I'm playing these high chords and the rhythm that's generating those off against so together they're sort of playing off each other and they're working quite nicely together. Now if we focus on this sound for the time being. So this is the one at normal pitch, and this is using, let me just come across to this part for a second, and this is using this world drums. So I'm just going to disable that quickly. I'm going to put the output back to stereo output. So that's what I'm using to generate the groove for this other sort of chord pattern. And what I'm also doing is I've also got the exact same thing, this time pitched down an octave. And now what I am doing, I'm also using a sample delay on both of these channels. One of them I'm delaying the left channel, the other one I'm delaying the right channel, which kind of spreads them out quite nicely to either side. Even though they're still a stereo channel, they're not hard panned left and right, they're still in both channels, but because of the delay they feel more like one's on one side and one's on the other. Kind of a psychoacoustic effect, I guess. Now if I were to, let's just bypass these. Now they sound much more in the center and they sound much more like a single sound. Whereas when I introduce these sample delays, it kind of gives it more separation. So there we go, I'm kind of using the noise gates to chop these chords. So just to demonstrate quickly, with this world drums, I'm sending that to bus 3. I've got the channel itself set to no output. I'm sending it on a pre-fader. I'm not sending it on a pre-fader. I thought I was. It doesn't really matter because this is set to no output. The other way we could do it would be to set it to a pre-fader and pull the fader amount down. Either or really. You don't even need to do it using a bus. I personally prefer doing it this way just because it gives a little bit more flexibility. So I'm using this bus 3 as the sidechain trigger for the input of this noise gate on this sound. So here I'm using bus 3. So you could do it other ways. I like doing it on a bus because I may possibly want to send more than one. I'm sending this world drums, but I might decide I want to send something else to that bus and kind of combine them to make one sidechain trigger. And using a bus gives me that option if I so choose. That's just how I like doing it. I will point out another thing I'm doing is I'm using a noise gate again on the actual trigger track, this world drums 3. Let me just set the output back to stereo output and I'll play you with and without. So you can hear in the original sample there's a lot of sort of boomy, those sort of congas, there's a lot of noise. In terms of working as a trigger, it's not so clearly defined because the volume doesn't drop down an awful lot in between each of the transients. However, using the noise gate allows us to get a much more kind of choppy, glitchy sound. And obviously we could smooth this out a bit. I quite like the very sort of glitchy, stuttery kind of sound. So again, the noise gate is proving to be quite a useful little tool. Instantly, we've gone from which is okay, but it's very kind of messy. There's not a lot of groove to it. It's not as clean and as clearly formed an idea, and it's just a bit messy and chaotic. However, by using these noise gates with some carefully chosen rhythmical elements to act as the triggers, we've got quite a groovy element now that really helped inspire me to put the rest of this track. I mean, this is literally what I started with. And we've only really got this, the bass, which I've split into two parts, one which is more the low sound, another one which I'm running through a bass amp with a bit more emphasis on the high frequencies to give it a bit more character. Also sending to this channel, which is kind of like my parallel drum compression, but it's also got some reverb on there. Not saying I would normally do. I haven't really spent any time mixing this tune, very quickly threw this together, so I would probably go in and work on this a lot more. I mean, that's very boomy, and that could definitely probably be cleaned up a little bit. Anyway, I'm getting off topic a little bit. So that's basically the whole idea. Again, this jazz bass was a loop that I dragged in from the loops. I did mess with it a little bit. Essentially, I think the original loop was starting on the high C. Ooh, not there. But I quite liked how it jumped back down to this low note, and I mean, everyone loves a bit of a bassy low note in there. And then just tweak the end just to make a nice little ending phrase for that. The drums are just a drummer track, and I've just sort of messed around with that, as you do with the drummer tracks, just to make it a bit more interesting. Okay, so what I'm going to show you in this second section here, I decided to, rather than use the gated chord sounds, I decided to return them back to the original sample and open them back up again. But in order to keep the same thematic gated feel running through it, I decided to apply the gate to the bass. And hang on, I've coloured these. I've just realised I've coloured these incorrectly. Sorry, these should be coloured to the same colour as the world drums, which is a kind of icy blue. Okay. Is that it? Yeah, something like that. Okay, so is that right? No, sorry, it's not. It's the blip groove. Okay, just ignore me. Okay, so if we come into this section here, what I've decided to do is to gate the bass using this blip groove. So where these chords open back up, instead the bass then becomes the sort of gated rhythmical element. So that sounds like this. If I take the noise gates back off, There's a lot more of the sort of sustained kind of notes, whereas this makes it a lot more sort of choppy. Now essentially this is exactly the same blip groove I used for the high chords in the first section. However, I have muted and deleted a few of the notes where they weren't quite working, and I think I might have had to move the odd note around. Essentially it's the same thing, just slightly modified just to make it work a bit better with the bass. So that sounds like this. And in context, and then we go back into the original idea, and it switches back around, so the bass opens back up and we go back to the sort of gated staccato chord sounds. Okay, that's pretty much it. I want to show you one other thing that I did, and that is on these green little sections where I put in where I basically sort of arranged the drummer track so that we'd have a nice interesting sort of drum feel. So that's one section, and there's another one here, I believe. And what I found was that the rhythm, the gated rhythm for these chords clashed a little bit with the drum fills. And what I decided to do was basically copy these instruments, not that one, sorry, and this one, and then use a noise gate on those again, but this time I'm actually sending the drummer track to another bus, and that is my third sidechain trigger. I'm sending this on a pre-fader so that in the mixing, if I'm sort of adjusting the volume here, it's not going to be changing the amount of signal from the trigger. That's going to remain constant, which is quite important. Another reason it's quite good to use buses. So, and that's kind of one thing I should point out. If you're using noise gates in your music and you're using it in this kind of creative way, at some point I would probably suggest the best thing to do is to bounce out some stems of the gated output. Mainly because when you get to the mixing stage, if you're using a noise gate and you're feeding a sidechain into that, if you pull down the levels of something, it may affect the noise gate and it may not be triggering and responding the way it was before you started mixing. So it's probably a wise decision to bounce down these things once you move past the sort of creative phase and into the more sort of mixing side of things. So back to this anyway. So I'm sending the drums to a bus, and that is now our sidechain trigger. So that sounds like this. And so we can hear that these chords are now in rhythm, in step with the actual drum fill. And especially here where we've got this that rhythm just with the other grooves going on just didn't work, but I like the feel, this sort of triplet groove that we've got going on. And it's an easy way to mimic the rhythm that we've got going on in the drum fill without having to sit and cut. Another way you could do it is, again, to sort of micro edit this audio and to cut these up into little bits, and making sure to put fades so there's no clicks and pops, and edit it according to the drum groove. But using a noise gate in this way, it takes a lot of the heartache out of having to sit and go through and modify every little hit, especially if you've got loads of different feels happening and they're all slightly different. It just makes it so much easier. So there we go, that's how I use noise gates creatively in this particular idea. This is something that I created in order to do a video about noise gates, but I'm actually really chuffed with the results. I think it sounds like quite a groovy track at the moment, and I'm gonna probably work on this some more.